In the dark winter of 1943, Europe lay in chains. From the Channel to the Balkans, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, Hitler's armies ruled a continent of silence and fear. But across the sea, in England, a new kind of army was gathering, one unlike anything the world had seen. They came from every corner of the free world: Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, Australians, New Zealanders, mechanics, tankers, pilots, engineers, sailors. They spoke in different accents, prayed in different ways, but they all carried the same quiet promise: to return freedom to a continent that had forgotten what it sounded like. That promise was codenamed Operation Overlord. It was not just another offensive, it was a gamble that would decide the fate of the war: the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. And the man who had to make it happen was a quiet, steady American from Kansas, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood something that few generals did. He knew that in modern war, courage was not enough. To defeat Hitler's fortress, the Allies would have to turn chaos into order, to coordinate air, sea, and land forces so precisely that the entire invasion would move as one living machine. He called it the Great Partnership. The idea was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Thousands of tanks and trucks would have to land on 5 separate beaches, while bombers struck inland defenses, paratroopers seized bridges, and fighters hunted anything that moved on German roads. Every wave, every bomb, every radio signal had to fit inside a single 24-hour plan. The entire invasion depended on timing, and timing depended on the sky. From the start, air superiority was not a luxury, it was the foundation. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had spent 3 years fighting for control of the European skies. By 1944, they had it.
Thousands of Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Typhoons filled the air every day. Bombers flew around the clock, turning the once invincible Luftwaffe into a shadow of its former power. But victory in the air alone meant nothing unless it could be joined to the steel on the ground. That connection began with the transportation plan, a quiet, mathematical campaign that preceded D-Day by months. Its goal? Isolate Normandy. Night after night, Allied bombers roared over France, striking rail junctions, bridges, and fuel depots. They weren't bombing cities, they were cutting nerves. The intent was not to destroy the enemy, but to paralyze him. Without railways, the German army could not move tanks or reinforcements to the beaches once the invasion began. Without fuel, its armored divisions would be trapped. By May 1944, the plan was working. Eisenhower's analysts calculated that German train traffic in northern France had dropped by more than 70%. Armored divisions were stranded hundreds of miles from the coast. When D-Day came, they would have to fight alone. Yet deception was as vital as destruction. Even as real troops trained in southern England, the Allies built an entire phantom army in the east, complete with fake tanks, inflatable trucks, and bogus radio transmissions. They called it Operation Fortitude. From the air, it looked real. German reconnaissance pilots saw thousands of vehicles parked in open fields near Dover. They heard radio chatter that sounded like preparation for an assault. To them, the invasion would come at Calais, the shortest crossing point across the Channel.
And that was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The illusion was so perfect that even on June 6th, after the real landings had begun, Hitler still kept the bulk of his panzer divisions guarding Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came. While deception misled the enemy, precision guided the Allies. In countless small airfields across southern England, pilots studied aerial photographs of the Normandy coast, every gun emplacement, every trench, every hedgerow mapped in detail. Navigators memorized landmarks, church steeples, rivers, crossroads. For the first time, a modern invasion would be planned not only by generals, but by the pilots above the battlefield. Aerial reconnaissance had given the Allies eyes sharper than any spies. They could see the beaches from the sky before the first soldier touched the sand. As spring turned to summer, England transformed into a giant armed camp. Roads filled with convoys of trucks and tanks. Airfields buzzed with aircraft and harbors brimmed with landing craft. Every village echoed with the sound of engines. Locals watched as columns of Shermans and Churchills rolled toward the coast, their tracks grinding the roads into dust. Pilots lived in temporary huts beside their aircraft, studying weather reports and flight plans. Tank crews slept inside their machines, surrounded by ammunition crates and ration tins. They knew something enormous was coming, but not when. Only a handful of commanders knew the exact day. They called it simply the day. On June 4th, the invasion was postponed. The weather was too violent: wind, fog, and rough seas. For 48 hours, the greatest armada in history waited on the English coast, engines idling, nerves fraying. Then, in the early hours of June 5th, a small window opened. Meteorologists reported a brief break in the storm, a single day of better weather before the next front rolled in. Eisenhower listened in silence. Every officer in the room knew that this was their only chance. If they delayed again, it could mean weeks of waiting, perhaps months. The Germans might discover the plan. Eisenhower stood, looked at his commanders, and said the words that would change history. "Okay, let's go."
By that night, the machine of Overlord was in motion. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men prepared to cross the Channel. The invasion had begun, not on the beaches, but in the sky. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off from English runways, long lines of C-47 Dakotas and Halifaxes carrying thousands of paratroopers. The men inside were silent, each one lost in thought. They checked their weapons, their harnesses, their watches. Below them, the English coast disappeared into black water. Ahead lay occupied France. The greatest gamble of the war was underway. The sky awakens. In the cold darkness of June 5, 1944, the skies over southern England came alive. Engines rumbled like distant thunder. Wings shimmered in the moonlight as formations of aircraft took off one after another, each heavy with men and hope. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were paratroopers, men who would fall from the sky to light the first spark of the invasion. 23,000 of them. American, British, and Canadian airborne divisions packed into hundreds of transport planes and gliders. Their mission was clear: strike deep behind enemy lines, destroy bridges, capture roads, block reinforcements, and hold the ground until the main force arrived from the sea. If they failed, the invasion would collapse before it began. The first wave crossed the English Channel in total darkness. Below, the sea rolled black and endless. Inside the planes, red lamps glowed faintly, casting long shadows on faces tight with fear. Outside, the night was a storm of flak and searchlights. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the Armada crossed the French coast. Tracer rounds clawed upward, ripping the sky apart. By that night, the machine of Overlord was in motion. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men prepared to cross the Channel. The invasion had begun, not on the beaches, but in the sky. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off from English runways, long lines of C-47 Dakotas and Halifaxes carrying thousands of paratroopers. The men inside were silent, each one lost in thought. They checked their weapons, their harnesses, their watches. Below them, the English coast disappeared into black water. Ahead lay occupied France. The greatest gamble of the war was underway. The sky awakens. In the cold darkness of June 5, 1944, the skies over southern England came alive. Engines rumbled like distant thunder. Wings shimmered in the moonlight as formations of aircraft took off one after another, each heavy with men and hope. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were paratroopers, men who would fall from the sky to light the first spark of the invasion. 23,000 of them. American, British, and Canadian airborne divisions packed into hundreds of transport planes and gliders. Their mission was clear: strike deep behind enemy lines, destroy bridges, capture roads, block reinforcements, and hold the ground until the main force arrived from the sea. If they failed, the invasion would collapse before it began. The first wave crossed the English Channel in total darkness. Below, the sea rolled black and endless. Inside the planes, red lamps glowed faintly, casting long shadows on faces tight with fear. Outside, the night was a storm of flak and searchlights. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the Armada crossed the French coast. Tracer rounds clawed upward, ripping the sky apart.
But the pilots pressed on. Radar beacons, codenamed Eureka and Rebecca, guided them toward their drop zones. At precisely 12:15 a.m., the green lights flashed. And then the sky began to rain men. Parachutes bloomed like ghostly flowers against the night. The roar of engines mixed with the crack of gunfire. In fields, rivers, and hedgerows, paratroopers hit the ground, scattered, disoriented, often miles from their targets. Many landed in flooded marshes, some drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed directly among German positions and fought from the moment they touched the earth. But despite chaos and confusion, small groups began to form. Using hand signals, flashlights, and instinct, they rallied and moved toward their objectives. Bridges were seized, roads were blocked, communication lines were cut. At Sainte-Mère-Église, American paratroopers fought to secure the first French town liberated in the invasion. To the east, British glider troops captured the Pegasus Bridge, a vital crossing over the Caen Canal. They had landed silently, in the dark, mere yards from the target. By dawn, the bridges were in Allied hands. The way inland was open. These men of the airborne forces were not alone. Above them, the rest of the sky belonged to the Allies. Wave after wave of bombers thundered toward the coast, striking at coastal batteries, bunkers, and radar stations. Each target had been studied for months, each strike timed to protect the men below. The coordination was breathtaking. From command posts in southern England, operations officers directed hundreds of squadrons by radio. Weather stations fed constant updates. Navigation planes dropped flares to mark paths through the clouds. Even as bombs fell, fighters circled above the landing zones to guard against any surviving Luftwaffe interceptors. This was not chaos, it was choreography. The dance of steel and sky had begun. At 3:30 a.m., glider waves began to arrive. Towed by heavy bombers, they glided silently toward the dark fields of Normandy, carrying jeeps, artillery, and small tanks.
Landing was brutal. Many gliders broke apart on impact, crushing men and cargo alike. But the survivors crawled from the wreckage and immediately began their tasks. By dawn, dozens of key crossroads and gun emplacements had been taken. German communications were in disarray. Commanders had no idea how many enemy troops were behind their lines or where they had come from. For the first time in 4 years, the occupied countryside heard something it had forgotten: the sound of foreign aircraft dropping men not to destroy, but to liberate. As dawn broke over Normandy, the full magnitude of the air operation became clear. More than 800 aircraft had carried paratroopers through storm, flak, and confusion. Nearly 500 gliders had landed, many wrecked, but their missions complete. The airborne forces had succeeded in their impossible task. They had turned chaos into control. The beaches now had a shield behind them. And as the first light touched the horizon, another storm gathered on the sea. 5,000 ships, each packed with men, tanks, and hope, began to move. The invasion of Europe was about to begin, and the coordination between sky and steel was about to be tested in the fire of battle. Far above the channel, bomber formations flew at 10,000 feet. Their engines droned endlessly, their bellies filled with bombs meant for the coastal defenses. Each pilot had his orders, exact timing, exact targets. The aerial bombardment would begin minutes before the landings. Its purpose was not only destruction, but confusion, to blind the defenders, to make them believe the entire coast was under attack.
But there was a risk. Too much bombing, and the beach would become a cratered wasteland impossible for tanks to cross. Too little, and the defenses would remain deadly. Precision mattered more than power. The balance between air and armor would decide everything. At 5:30 a.m., the first explosions lit the horizon. The roar of artillery and bomb blasts rolled across the water like thunder. On every ship, soldiers looked toward the French coast, a long, dark line under the morning sky. And then they saw it. The flash of guns, the columns of smoke, the silhouettes of landing craft moving toward the shore. The air war had cleared the way. Now the war of steel was about to begin. The first light of June 6, 1944, crept slowly over the English Channel. The horizon glowed pale gold, then bled into gray. And out of that gray, an armada appeared. More than 5,000 ships, stretching as far as the eye could see. Destroyers, landing craft, battleships, transports, a sea of steel carrying the hopes of the free world. Each vessel carried men who had been silent for hours. Some prayed. Some checked their rifles again and again. Some simply stared at the horizon, where the coast of France waited under the guns of the enemy.
They had trained for this for years. Now everything depended on coordination, the dance between sky and sea, between bombers above and tanks below. The largest invasion in human history had begun. At 6 a.m., the air erupted. From the east came squadrons of Allied bombers, hundreds of aircraft sweeping over the beaches at low altitude, dropping payloads meant to shatter German defenses. Behind them, fighters roared through the mist, strafing bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests. Each attack was guided by precise timing. Every pilot had his map, every squadron its minute. The bombardment had to end the moment the landing craft touched shore. Too soon, and it would fail to clear the way. Too late, and it would destroy the very men it was meant to protect. Above the water, the sky burned with tracer fire. Below, the sea boiled with landing craft, plowing through waves under the cover of smoke and chaos. The Allied fleet moved forward in 5 great waves, each bound for a code name that would be carved into history. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. At Utah Beach, the Americans landed first. Strong currents pushed many craft off course, but the mistake saved them. They landed in a lightly defended sector. By luck and coordination, the tanks that reached shore were able to support the infantry immediately. Amphibious DD tanks, Shermans wrapped in canvas flotation skirts, churned through the surf. Their propellers buzzed like bees, their turrets already trained on the sand. As the ramps dropped, the tanks rolled into the shallows and opened fire on the German bunkers. Behind them, the infantry advanced, crouching behind the moving armor. It was the first great test of the partnership between steel and sky.
Above the tanks, thunderbolts and typhoons screamed down, unleashing rockets and cannon fire on any target the tank commanders marked by radio.
The air was a symphony of destruction, precise, deliberate, devastating. Within 3 hours, Utah Beach was secure, but Omaha was different. Here, the storm had turned the sea into a trap. The DD tanks launched too far from shore. Most sank beneath the waves, dragging their crews with them. When the landing craft reached the beach, the infantry found themselves alone, pinned under withering machine gun fire from the cliffs above. The air bombardment, meant to destroy the defenses, had fallen too far inland. German bunkers were untouched. The beach became a killing ground. Bodies floated in the tide. Men lay flat in the sand, unable to move. For hours, chaos ruled Omaha. Then, slowly, coordination began to return. Navy destroyers, ignoring orders, moved dangerously close to the shore, so close that their hulls scraped the seabed. They fired directly into the German defenses at point-blank range. Above, Allied pilots, guided by smoke signals from the beach, dove through enemy fire to hit the remaining strongpoints. Tankers who had made it ashore began firing up the cliffs, while infantry crawled forward under the cover of that fire. Piece by piece, Omaha began to move. By midday, the first tank had reached the top of the bluff. Behind it came hundreds of exhausted, mud-covered soldiers. The impossible beach had been taken.
Farther east, the British and Canadians fought across Gold, Juno, and Sword. There, the tank-air coordination reached its peak. At Juno, Canadian Shermans equipped with bulldozer blades smashed through beach obstacles, while Spitfires and Typhoons provided overhead support. Every time a tank commander called in a target, a gun nest, a machine gun pit, a line of barbed wire, within minutes a rocket barrage came screaming down from the sky. At Gold, British engineers used specialized tanks, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, to clear mines and obstacles. Flamethrower tanks incinerated bunkers, mine flails beat the sand ahead of the infantry. The airmen above worked as their invisible allies, striking deeper targets, cutting supply routes, ensuring that no German reinforcements could reach the beaches. And at Sword, where German counterattacks threatened to break through, British armor and Typhoons combined to halt them in their tracks. The cooperation was exact, practiced, and deadly. Each tank advance was shadowed by the roar of jet-like fighter bombers above. By late morning, 4 of the 5 beaches were secure. The 5th, Omaha, followed soon after. By nightfall, the Allies had landed over 150,000 men and thousands of tanks, trucks, and vehicles. The beaches of Normandy, once Hitler's fortress, were now in Allied hands. But victory on the sand was only the beginning. Beyond the dunes lay the bocage, a labyrinth of hedgerows, stone walls, and narrow lanes. Perfect ground for ambushes, terrible ground for tanks. The next phase of the war would be a battle not of beaches, but of fields, where the coordination between air and armor would decide the fate of the breakout. Yet on that first night, as the guns fell silent and the sea receded, one truth was clear. The impossible had been achieved. Through discipline, precision, and the perfect harmony of men, machines, and the skies above, the Allies had done what the world thought could never be done. They had stormed a continent and lived.
As darkness fell on June 6th, pilots returned to their bases in England, their fuel tanks empty, their nerves shattered. Ground crews met them with cheers, then silence, as they counted the missing. On the beaches, tankers dug in among wreckage and smoke, knowing the counterattack would come at dawn. The coordination between air and armor had saved the invasion, but now it would have to hold the line. The battle for Normandy, the true test of steel and sky, was only beginning. The morning after D-Day smelled of diesel, smoke, and salt. The beaches of Normandy were secure, but barely. Every inch of sand behind the dunes was now a living machine, a tangle of supply trucks, engineers, tanks, bulldozers, and men digging foxholes into the soft earth. The sea still glimmered with wreckage, sunken landing craft, twisted metal, bodies floating among oil slicks. Yet above it all rose the steady hum of engines. C-47 transports, fighters, reconnaissance planes, an endless stream crossing the channel, carrying the pulse of the Allied invasion. The world had changed overnight. But Hitler's army was far from defeated. The German high command had been stunned by the landings, yet by dawn on June 7th, panzer divisions were already on the move. From Caen in the east and St. Lo in the west, steel columns rumbled north. Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, the pride of the Wehrmacht. They would strike the beaches and throw the invaders back into the sea. The Allies knew they were coming, and this time they were ready. In the hedgerow country beyond the beaches, tanks rolled through narrow lanes hemmed in by ancient earthen walls. Every intersection, every farmhouse, every line of trees could hide an ambush. The land was beautiful, green, lush, alive. But to those who fought there, it was hell.
German tanks waited behind the hedgerows, their guns trained on the gaps. Every time an Allied tank moved forward, the countryside seemed to explode. What followed was a battle of coordination, not between armies, but between elements, between air and ground, between armor and the pilots who guided death from above. Allied tankers learned to fight in tandem with their airmen. When a panzer column was spotted, they radioed their coordinates to the nearest forward air controller. Men crouched with signal flares and maps, often only a mile ahead of the lines. Within minutes, the sky would fill with the growl of engines. The Typhoon fighter bombers came first, British-built monsters with rocket rails under their wings. They dove through clouds at terrifying speed, unleashing 8 high-explosive rockets that could split a tank in half. Behind them came the Thunderbolts, American P-47s, big, rugged, unstoppable, strafing roads, supply lines, and convoys. To the men below, it was salvation. To the Germans, it was annihilation. Every attack was followed by the same thunderous silence, the sound of the air being sucked away after a rocket strike. One British tank commander, watching a Typhoon obliterate a Panther ahead of him, whispered over his radio, "Thank God for the boys in the sky." By mid-June, the Germans realized that their tanks could not move by day. Every road was watched. Every bridge was under fire. Even a single plume of dust could bring an airstrike. Panzer commanders began moving only at night, covering their tracks with camouflage nets and smoke. But the Allies had an answer for that too. The Mosquito and the night-flying bombers, guided by radar and reconnaissance. There was nowhere to hide. The war had entered a new phase, one dominated not by numbers, but by coordination, precision, and timing. In the British sector, the fight centered around Caen, a city of stone and ruin. Montgomery's troops, supported by air power, fought block by block, street by street.
The Typhoons circled overhead like hawks, striking German strongpoints with uncanny accuracy. Whenever Allied tanks became trapped, the pilot swooped in, rockets, cannon bursts, then silence. At night, Pathfinder aircraft dropped flares over the battlefield, turning darkness into day. Tank commanders watched the sky as much as they did the ground, knowing that their survival depended on that invisible partnership above. Farther west, the Americans fought through the hedgerows toward St. Lo. Each field was a fortress, each lane a trap. The enemy's anti-tank guns fired from hidden positions, knocking out Shermans one after another. The infantry couldn't advance. The armor couldn't maneuver. The battle ground to a halt. And then, the Americans changed the rules. They began coordinating every tank assault with airstrikes.
Pilots flew so low they could see the mud on the tank hulls. They dropped smoke bombs to mark friendly positions, then turned their guns on the next hedgerow over. The effect was devastating. Panzer grenadiers were blown out of their positions. Machine gun nests vanished in fire and dust. For the first time, tanks and aircraft fought as one. In late July, after weeks of grinding attrition, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. The plan was simple: destroy the German front lines with an air bombardment so massive that the enemy's defenses would collapse in hours. On July 25, 1944, the sky darkened. More than 3,000 Allied aircraft gathered over a 10-mile front, flying fortresses, liberators, marauders, bombers as far as the eye could see. They came in waves, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on the German lines near St. Lo. The earth shook. Fire and smoke rose like storm clouds. When the bombing ended, the tanks moved in. Columns of Shermans, Churchills, and Cromwells advanced through the wreckage, their tracks grinding over shattered ground. There was no organized resistance, only stunned survivors and burning armor.
The German front broke apart. The Allies surged forward. In less than a week, they'd punched through the line that had held them for nearly 2 months. The open country lay ahead, and with it, the road to Paris. The success of Operation Cobra was not luck. It was the result of relentless coordination, the perfect harmony between air and ground, forged through trial and blood. Every pilot trusted the men below. Every tank commander trusted the eyes in the sky. They had learned to move as one, to fight as one, to win as one. And from that unity came momentum, the unstoppable force that would carry the Allies across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. As July gave way to August, the air over Normandy shimmered with victory. Everywhere, the same phrase echoed through Allied radios: "Steel and sky together." It wasn't just a phrase, it was a creed. Because on the ground, a tank without air cover was a target. In the sky, a pilot without a ground marker was blind. But together, they were invincible. The partnership that began on the beaches had become the engine of liberation. The dust over Normandy hung for days. The earth was blackened, the air thick with the smell of cordite and oil. But for the first time since D-Day, the front lines were moving. Operation Cobra had cracked the German defenses wide open. The Allies had broken free of the hedgerows, and now, finally, the battlefield belonged to the armor. Columns of Shermans thundered down open roads, their turrets swinging, engines roaring in chorus. Beside them, half-tracks carried infantry through villages reduced to rubble.
Overhead, the sky never slept. From dawn until dusk, the air hummed with Allied aircraft. Spitfires patrolled the clouds. Mustangs and Thunderbolts struck deep behind enemy lines. And bombers, hundreds of them, shattered the bridges, railways, and crossroads that the Germans depended on. Every movement on the ground was shadowed by wings. Every advance was guided by the eyes above. The coordination was absolute. When German armor tried to regroup, the radio codes went out instantly. Panzer Movement Grid 34B, request immediate strike. Minutes later, the sky screamed. Typhoons diving low, firing rockets into the tree line. The explosions tore the earth apart, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a storm of iron answering their call. By late July, the German army was in retreat. But it was no simple withdrawal. Hitler had ordered his generals to counterattack, to strike west, to cut the Allied advance in half and drive it back to the sea. The result was chaos and opportunity. At Falaise, the German 7th Army and Panzer forces found themselves trapped between two advancing Allied fronts. From the north came the Canadians and Poles, from the south, the Americans. Between them lay a narrow corridor, the Falaise Pocket, a killing ground of smoke, mud, and metal. Here, the partnership of steel and sky would reach its most devastating form. The Germans tried to escape through the corridor under cover of darkness, but the Allies had learned to fight the night. Overhead, the sky never slept. From dawn until dusk, the air hummed with Allied aircraft. Spitfires patrolled the clouds. Mustangs and Thunderbolts struck deep behind enemy lines. And bombers, hundreds of them, shattered the bridges, railways, and crossroads that the Germans depended on. Every movement on the ground was shadowed by wings. Every advance was guided by the eyes above. The coordination was absolute. When German armor tried to regroup, the radio codes went out instantly. Panzer Movement Grid 34B, request immediate strike. Minutes later, the sky screamed. Typhoons diving low, firing rockets into the tree line. The explosions tore the earth apart, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a storm of iron answering their call. By late July, the German army was in retreat. But it was no simple withdrawal. Hitler had ordered his generals to counterattack, to strike west, to cut the Allied advance in half and drive it back to the sea. The result was chaos and opportunity. At Falaise, the German 7th Army and Panzer forces found themselves trapped between two advancing Allied fronts. From the north came the Canadians and Poles, from the south, the Americans. Between them lay a narrow corridor, the Falaise Pocket, a killing ground of smoke, mud, and metal. Here, the partnership of steel and sky would reach its most devastating form. The Germans tried to escape through the corridor under cover of darkness, but the Allies had learned to fight the night.
Radar-equipped aircraft scoured the roads. Searchlights and tracer rounds turned the sky into a lattice of fire. Every time a convoy tried to move, the air erupted. Bombers dropped their payloads. Fighters strafed the roads. The trapped divisions disintegrated under the storm. Tank columns were reduced to twisted wreckage. Vehicles burned in rows that stretched for miles. By dawn, the Falaise Pocket was a graveyard of steel. The destruction was total. More than 10,000 German soldiers lay dead. Tens of thousands more were captured. The escape routes were gone, cut apart by coordination. By the end of August, the road to Paris lay open. The German army in France had ceased to exist as an organized force. Its tanks were destroyed, its fuel exhausted, its will shattered. The Allied spearheads raced forward, their movements choreographed by the unseen rhythm of air command. Every column of tanks had its guardians in the sky. Every advance was cleared by aerial reconnaissance before the first tread moved. It was not just victory. It was precision warfare on a scale the world had never seen. In every village they passed, the French came out of hiding. They lined the roads with flowers, tears, and flags pulled from cellars. They climbed onto tanks, cheering, weeping, thanking the men who had fought for them. The pilots flying above could see it all, columns of armor rolling through crowds of liberated civilians. They banked their wings in salute, white contrails glimmering in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the sound of engines over France meant freedom. On August 25, 1944, Paris rose in revolt. The city had waited too long, suffered too much. As German forces prepared to withdraw, the Allies moved in from every direction. American and Free French armored divisions entered the city under the cover of air patrols. Every avenue echoed with the rumble of tanks and the cheers of the liberated. When General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division reached the center of Paris, the bells began to ring. From the Notre Dame to Montmartre, the sound carried across the city, a song of deliverance, of defiance, of rebirth.
It would shape every battlefield that came after. In the early days of the invasion, the idea of coordinating tanks and aircraft had been radical. Commanders distrusted what they couldn't control. Pilots and tankers spoke different codes, lived in different worlds. But Normandy changed that forever. There, amid the sand and hedgerows, necessity forced cooperation. Radios crackled between ground units and airfields. Forward air controllers rode in jeeps with antennas reaching to the sky, guiding the thunder with hand signals and colored smoke. Pilots learned to read the land, to distinguish friend from foe by the shape of a tank turret or the glint of sunlight on armor. It was no longer just an army and an air force. It was one organism, one mind made of many. And that unity became unstoppable. In the months that followed, the lessons of Overlord were written to every plan, every strategy. Operation Market Garden, though flawed, used air-ground coordination on a vast scale. Gliders, paratroopers, tanks, and bombers woven into one daring assault. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied air forces grounded, and for days the ground troops fought blind. When the skies cleared, the difference was immediate. Fighters and bombers returned, and the German advance began to collapse. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the relationship between tank and pilot was seamless. The sky no longer watched from above, it fought beside the ground. But the real legacy of Overlord wasn't just in victory. It was in evolution. The principles forged in 1944 would become the foundation of modern warfare. The concept of close air support, born in the smoke of Normandy, became standard doctrine. Armies learned that mobility without cover was suicide, that every tank, every convoy, every foot soldier needed eyes in the sky.
But the essence never changed. Air and armor working as one. The men who fought at Normandy could never have imagined the technology their courage would inspire. They had no satellites, no drones, no computers. Only instinct, trust, and timing. And yet, they achieved what no army had done before: total coordination. In the decades that followed, historians would study every movement of D-Day, the timing of the air raids, the path of the landing craft, the positioning of the tanks, and realize that this was more than a battle. It was a revolution in how humans wage war, a transformation from brute force to orchestration, from chaos to choreography. The sky had become the shield and the sword of the ground below. Still, for those who were there, it wasn't doctrine or destiny they remembered. It was the sound. The steady heartbeat of engines across the dawn. The shriek of rockets diving toward the shore. The hiss of tank treads on wet sand. The pilots and tankers never saw each other's faces, yet they shared the same sky, the same danger, the same faith. They were bound by invisible threads of smoke and steel, by radios and courage,
by the single belief that coordination could conquer chaos. And it did. When the war finally ended in 1945, many of those who had fought in Normandy went home and never spoke of it again. But their legacy endured in every field manual, every training flight, every armored brigade that followed. The lessons of D-Day became the DNA of modern militaries. Even peace was shaped by them, by the understanding that control of the sky meant survival on the ground. The invisible partnership of 1944 still echoes today in the hum of jet engines, in the whir of rotor blades, in the silent watch of satellites. It began with men in muddy uniforms and propeller planes, and it became the defining truth of warfare.
And yet, beyond the tactics and the strategy, the story of Operation Overlord remains something more. It is the story of courage, not just to fight, but to cooperate, of pilots who trusted the tankers below, of soldiers who looked up and believed that someone was watching over them. It is the story of 1,000 moving parts, men, machines, elements fused into one purpose: to take back a continent, to end tyranny, to reclaim the future. And they did it not through strength alone, but through unity, through the perfect balance of steel and sky. The wind over Normandy is quiet now. The beaches are peaceful, the fields green again. But if you stand there at dawn, you can still imagine it. The distant thunder of engines, the low hum of aircraft beyond the clouds, the ghosts of tanks rolling toward destiny. For one brief, furious summer, the world was held together by men who believed that precision could overcome fear. And they proved it true. In that harmony of courage and coordination, they didn't just win a battle. They changed the very meaning of war. Steel and sky, forever intertwined.